It's great to see so many of you here at this hour. In Finland, that's where I come from, people would not show up at 5 o'clock. Or the other option for this is you're here because you love testing and test automation so much that you would even spend your nights with that. So that's also a good possibility here. So we'll spend the next a little less than an hour talking about things that I've learned over the years in automation. I've been doing testing for about 20 years now. I've been, well, he kind of mentions things that I have as a hobby. I've been teaching kids programming for the last 2 years. And I've only actually personally been more into test automation in the last 2 years. And you'll hear some of the stories on how I got into be more keen on automation stuff myself, and not just, look at it from the perspective of a tester or a test manager who works in organizations. What I want to talk to you about today is basically perfecting the craft of test automation. What I feel that is happening right now is that I'm seeing that we're actually getting pretty good in various organizations in doing test automation, having code be part of the way we test. And while we are getting to be good in including that, I still see that all the organizations who have even extensive automation, they seem to be struggling with similar things that kind of bring us together into these events to talk about how do we solve the same problems, how do we solve the issues that we have. And I wanted to share some lessons on that with you. I work at a company right now called F-Secure. I've been there for 10 weeks now, so I'm not going to tell you all the nitty-gritty details of how F-Secure works, but this is not my first time at F-Secure. I rejoined a company that I used to work at 10 years ago. And I wanted to talk to you about this because there's a bit of a difference in how I see the world when 10 years have passed. The company that I left 10 years ago didn't have much of system-level test automation. That company, F-Secure back then, 10 years ago, had just started getting developers introduced with unit tests. And I remember we were struggling. I remember that there were difficulties in getting developers to figure out what would a good unit test look like. That wasn't a straightforward and easy thing. And the whole automation on the system level, from the whole product point of view, we had been using various third-party tools. I think at the time when I was there 10 years ago, we were using, if I remember correctly, 3 different commercial tools back then. And they were always ending up in these small isolated, couple of people who were assigned to it, super excited, this is a cool tool, the best tool ever. And then the rest of the organization was like, oh, I have this real work to do, can you please stop bothering me? And it just somehow died when those people moved away. But in the 10 years that I was away, and I wasn't doing anything about it, I wasn't being helpful, or I wasn't being a hindrance. They had finally managed to do something about test automation. And I joined an organization 10 weeks ago where there's significant level of system-level automation based on Python, based on self-made frameworks, based on team ownership of that automation. And it kind of looks like the way I would like to see that the test automation enthusiastic organizations are doing test automation right now. That they are actually putting effort into that, they're seeing success with that, and things are working in many ways. But still, there's some challenges, there's still some things that need to be addressed, and those are the things that I want to talk to you about today. So I feel that my current place of work is a good representative in the sense that that's kind of the things that I see in a lot of companies nowadays, that we've taken significant steps forward in automating, testing. We've taken significant steps in having actually automated scripts running, continuously giving us feedback and helping us make those releases. And I see that in a lot of organizations, we may have very different choices of languages. Some of us have chosen tools that we heavily rely on. Others, we've built our own testing frameworks. But today, I find that when we meet in these conferences, we talk about the fact that there's actually already tools and means to do things well. But still, there's something that we might be missing. The current day of automation, I feel that it's kind of in the sense that we are looking at things, even automating, as a thing that is done by people. Some of the best automation that I see is done by really, really good developers. How many of you identify here as a developer, by the way? Developers? Identifying as developers? Okay, a few people. How many of you identify as test automators? Majority. Anyone here who identifies as a manual or an exploratory tester? Some of those as well. All right. So we have a nice mix of people. But whatever we do in testing, this whole good world of test automation, it requires that we have good people with good ideas, and the automation is as good as those brilliant people make it. So that's kind of the baseline from where we start with. And from this baseline, I have 3 lessons that I want to go through with you. The first lesson is about clean code. You might find this slightly surprising when we're talking about test automation, but I find that from my decades of experience, all the test automation that I've seen in various organizations, we have put a lot of effort into test automation that doesn't actually help us if we didn't simultaneously think of the good structures in the test automation, but also the good structures in the production code that we are testing with the test automation. So if you have a swamp and it's kind of shaky and you don't know if it stays together, the test automation is probably going to be a little harder, and we're going to talk a bit more on that later. The second lesson that I want to talk about today is about bringing the people together. We have all kinds of skills, all kinds of knowledge, and different kinds of experiences. And sharing the information, sharing the knowledge that we've gained, there's some special tricks or ways that I want to share with you today. And the third point is that I find that, well, I use the word test automation, and I know that I made just Richard cringe when he even saw that word on my slides. Can't we talk about tools in testing? That's what he usually mentions. I still intentionally talk about test automation, but I'd like to talk about test automation in the sense of we can understand it as a wider concept, giving us a lot other opportunities than just the regular regression idea. And I wanted to introduce you to some of the stuff that I'm super excited about in automation that has been around for a few years and that has definitely been in my life in the last couple of years. So that's kind of the agenda for today. So let's start with the clean code aspect. So I wanted to start with a bit of a story. About 4.5 years ago, I joined an organization that was struggling. I was the first ever tester in that organization. They had been doing software development for 20 years. First ever tester. They were making monthly releases, so clearly a tester wasn't necessary. But they needed a tester because about 18% of their logged in users during a working day saw a big visible error message. 18%, that's kind of high. The developers in the teams, they were totally puzzled. Like, we don't know what the users are doing. It's totally mysterious. We don't know. We have no idea. So they were thinking like, yeah, maybe we'll get here what they call then a test manager, to help the developers figure out how to do automated testing better, how to do testing in general better, and how to figure out how to fix the application. Well, most of my effort at first went into fixing the problems by telling the repro steps. If you click here, if you do this, if you change this just a little bit, then you'll see one of these crashes. And we got together with the developers, we got that down to one level of 1%. But that was just one of the things that we were doing. In general, I was brought in there to help the developers figure out how do we do testing, how would we do test automation, how would we do manual testing so that we as a team would manage to do things better. And I had one-on-ones with all of the developers, and I was asking them that I was given now this allocation, half of every one of your time. You're now under my management for other half of your time, and under the project manager's management for the other half. I want us to do testing. What opinions do you have on this testing that we would do? And every developer in the one-on-ones and in every public meeting that we would have, they kept telling me that seriously, you can't ask us to do manual testing because it's boring and awful and repetition, and this breaks in every possible way. We hate that. We want to do something about the cause of this. And it's the same with automation. We don't want to add automation or unit tests or system level tests. We don't want to add those if the code is as bad as it has gotten to be. So my developers, all of them in unison, were telling that our code is a mess. We have not been allowed to clean it up. We have not been allowed to refactor it. And if we're trying to put some tests on top of this, it's just not going to make things any better. It's just going to be harder and more difficult. So I listened to them. And I decided that even though I was hired as a tester, I was allocated a testing budget. I can play a 6-month gamble. I told the developers that whenever I give you a task to test, take it as a permission to refactor. It's your time to make things easier so that you can clean the code up and you can be refactoring. And that actually changed the whole way for us on how we built the software. That was a big part of how we got to the 0.5% of the end user visible errors. That was a big part on how the developers again started to like doing work on the code. And we also learned as a team that when we would read the code, when we would talk around the code and we would actually understand what the code does, we would need so much less of the automation that, the high-level managers, they were kind of thinking that, it's a testing problem. Lots of bugs. We need more of testing. What we actually needed is more of a approach for doing the code as a clean one. So I had the choice between doing testing and doing refactoring, and I started with, let's first do refactoring, let's then add some unit tests, let's then add some Selenium tests, let's then add some integration tests against the middle layer things, with the data in the user, data in the databases, and like one by one goal by one, we took steps forward in that world. So all of this really taught me that technical depth is a core concept that even the manual testers should be actually caring about, but automation testers in particular. If the code that your automation tests, if it's brittle, if it's unclear, if it's badly shapen, probably your tests will find problems, but those problems would be more effectively and efficiently found by other means. So this whole technical depth as a concept, it's not something we plan for. It's not intentional. It usually just happens. It's kind of like, gaining weight. No one, I think, plans for actually gaining weight. Well, some people do, but it's a minority. You don't plan for it, but it comes out of the habits. And fixing the habits is a big part of getting better at these kind of things. If you have messy code, you can add automation, but it's not going to help you much because it's going to cause side effects. We did some tests around in different organizations around messy code, and I remember one organization in particular where we had this test automation team. We had problems that we were finding, we were reporting them with nice videos and all that. And we were always kind of like playing this ping pong and chase between the two different parties in trying to get things in place. And before we started more collaborative approaches, we couldn't really get far with this one. But it's not just the production code. It is first the production code, but it's also the test automation code. Those of who you identify as test automators, do you think of yourself as people who write code? Who thinks of yourself as a person who writes code as a test automator? I write code. Other option, I use tools. Some people do that as well, okay? So a lot of times I find that when we are doing automation, it is actually a programming effort. And all the same rules and things that we're talking about, how do we do good code, version control, having somebody review whatever we did, having teams somehow collaborate, understanding the requirements before we jump into doing things. The exact same things about cleanliness and good practices, they apply to the test automation code as well. And if there is something that you can do to make things better in the world of difficulties in existing automation, I find that often it comes from the fact that you find ways of thinking how your tests could be smaller. Like for example, last week I walked to a colleague of mine at F-Secure, and I actually wanted to just see, like a show of manual testing, do some pair testing so that we could figure out a way for me to learn that application. And at the same time, when she was showing me around the application, I was asking like, hey, how do you test this? And hey, what kind of tools you have? And where's your test data? And I started suggesting that, hey, for automation purposes, since we have brittle tests, sometimes they fail even if they shouldn't. Maybe here would be a way of cutting things so that we wouldn't test this whole long chain of things. Maybe we could fake this part here. And the developers would jump right into the discussion and say like, hey, we can easily make you that service. And it just turns out that we had never had that type of a discussion in that team, that we could, make our tests smaller. So a lot of times it's really about someone opening their mouth and saying that we could do these things a bit smaller. And smaller is better in the sense that they run faster, they're more granular. At least I find it very painful when my test automation fails. And the first thing I will do is figure out from the logs on which point of time or which point of the script this is now failing. And I really like the unit tests that we have in the sense that they pinpoint right away that, hey, here's a unit test that is failing. This is where we should be looking at. So the granularity of the tests is a big part of things. And when I talk about cleanliness of code, I really talk about people. Code is people. Code is written by people. Tools are written by people. I stole this from a tweet by Richard last week. I probably use it in a different context than he originally imagined. But I think that whenever any one of us in our organizations need to say that our tests are flaky, we're actually saying we're missing information, we're missing skills, we're missing knowledge. And the next step should be to go and find that knowledge and skill from somewhere. Maybe it's within that organization, or maybe it's going search online. But there's definitely a skill to build there. We often talk about automation as something that is really, really key and core. I think it is. In the world of Agile, where we deliver continuously, test automation has a big part. But I also wanted to kind of mention the idea that in the organization that I talked to you about, the 4.5 years ago I joined and let them do refactoring at first. After a year in that organization, we started doing daily releases to production. We didn't have any test automation at that point, none. Daily releases without automation. It was basically founded with the idea that programming is a manual activity. So testing next to programming can be also manual activity. And we would only merge things into the main line when the manual activities were done, and then we would go forward. So for almost a year and a half, we did daily releases without any automation until we started getting to the point where we started adding automation layer by layer, test by test, one by one. So this whole concept of continuous delivery, it's more based on being able to split the risks than having the automation there to help you. So I would encourage you to make sure that you have these small cycles and feedback. So my first lesson really is on clean code. I believe, from my experiences in various organizations, talking with various developers in particular, that we won't be solving the challenges with brittleness, with unreliable automation, and lack of collaboration unless we get everyone into the same page. And a big part of that same page is understanding or caring about our code, both test automation code and production code, so that it's as easy to maintain over long term as possible. So this kind of leads us into my second lesson. I'm a big fan of an approach to development called mob programming. And it's been, for me, kind of a thing where many things have changed for me, in the sense that I realized about a year ago when I was doing one presentation that during my career I've actually been programming in 13 different languages. 13. And I call myself still mostly non-programming programmer. I write code when I can't get other people to write the code for me, but I talk around the code pretty much every day. I look at the architectures, I look at the choices of languages, I look at the enthusiasm that we have around automation, and that's a big part for me. But before I started to understand and have more empathy to people who feel differently than I do, I felt that there was much more of a gap. So I want to talk a bit about this idea of a mind share and what that actually means. I find that in a lot of organizations, there's these 3 different types of testers. I say testers intentionally, even though one of them here is an application programmer. Programmers test like crazy nowadays. The amount of unit testing that Agile programmers do, it's sometimes insane. Any one of you have run into test-infected programmers? Has anyone seen one of those? Maybe. The test-infected programmers often are people who talk to me back and tell me that they can automate everything because they are really good programmers as well. So whatever challenge I throw at them, they usually know a way of finding a way of automating it. But we usually have these 3 roles. We have people who are more into, I hate the word manual, I don't want to say manual, brain-engaged testing, exploratory testing, thinking around problems in the testing domain, understanding requirements of what would we want to test, and what would be a reliable way of getting information about that. Then we often have people who specialize in test automation, automation specialists. I consider them also one brand of programmers. They're somehow kind of in between these testers and the application programmers. They're somehow kind of like taking a bit from the both domains, and sometimes not identifying as programmers at all. So we have these 3 different kinds of roles, and sometimes, actually quite a lot of times, these people just don't talk too well to each other. Any of you use Twitter? Is there any Twitter users here? I don't see much tweets from here, so I had to ask. You might be lucky because you don't get to see the Twitter wars. There's Twitter war always ongoing with the people who like test automation and people who are more into the exploratory side of testing. Whether you can automate and how much you can automate. But I'm not really into that kind of like the barriers between these 3 people. I want to just recognize that they are different skill sets, different entry points. And if you come into this field of testing, probably you won't have all the information on day 1. And you won't have all the different experiences on day 1. And in software industry, there's a rule of thumb saying that the size of the industry doubles every 5 years, which actually would mean then that about half of us have less than 5 years of experience. So it's kind of a natural thing that we come into one of these, even if we would move around a lot. But we have different experiences, different backgrounds, different interests that take us into this. So the mind share between these three different kinds of people is through a mechanism that we call mob programming or mob testing. I call it mob testing whenever it's about a testing activity. If it's about a programming activity, then I usually call it mob programming. There's a guy in San Diego, California, USA, called Woody Zuil. And about 5 years ago, he and his team discovered this way of working by accident, that they would all work on one computer, just one computer to type in all the code that they would be doing. And with that one computer, they would take turns who's in front of the computer, usually starting from 4 to 5 minutes on the computer. And then they would rotate around so that whoever is on the computer, that's a resting position. You are supposed to be just listening to what the others say and do whatever the others are saying, and not do thinking or decisions of yourself. And all the other information comes from these others. They're called navigators. And the navigators will tell you where to go and what to do with the computer. And you, again, rotate on a frequent basis. So it's kind of like a mind share with all these people. You might see that on this picture, there's this little girl here. I have to show her. She's 9 years old. You might wonder what she's doing there. I use this picture because I think it's super inspirational to me. This is from an Agile conference in US. And this girl was invited to join the programming mob. They were doing TDD exercises. She was invited to join the programming mob, and she said, no, I won't. Why would I? I'm not a programmer. I don't know what to do. She watched them do this mob programming for 10 minutes. And she said, this looks like a fun game, Dad. Can I join after all? I know how to play this. So the game went so that they would draw an example on a whiteboard, the next test drive the application that they were creating. Then they would turn that picture or example from the whiteboard into English, intentional programming. And then they would translate that English in comments into code. So that usually for a sentence of English, there was a sentence of code implemented as well. So she said, I can play this game. She would boss this older gentleman here and tell that I want you to code that for me. She didn't need to know exactly how to do that. And when she took her turn on the keyboard, they would tell her letter by letter what to type so that she could do things. So it's a mechanism that actually adjusts to different skill levels really well. I heard about this about 2 years ago in a conference that I organized in Finland. And I was listening to Woody Zuil talk about it. And I was like, this is ridiculous. It won't work. It's just like, it can't work. But I took it back to my office and I started doing this with my developers once a week. And to my surprise, the developers who never really well understood exploratory testing learned to explore really well. I'm really proud of the way they test nowadays, even without automation. Through understanding testing better, they learned how they could put that into automation. All of us learned to do Selenium that only one of us knew how to do. We learned how to turn our unit tests not only into asserts, simple asserts, but into approvals as well, like more complicated tests of a certain format. And we learned to add tests before we would even implement things. So there were a lot of things that kind of came out from us working together in this format. So the mindshare is really to help different people with different perspectives contribute to the same task, with the idea that if you have good moments and you have bad moments, somebody else might have different good moments and different bad moments. And if these time-wise, when you're in the same room, if these time-wise compensate each other, you get the best out of everyone into the work you're doing. And a lot of information is also shared that way. So the idea with mobbing in general is about raising our collective competencies, collecting competencies, making sure the individuals come in with whatever skills they have, but they leave with more skills. You're welcome in a mob if you're learning or contributing, and a lot of times you're doing both. And the contribution might be anything from actually knowing exactly how certain automation problem needs to be solved. It might be knowing how you want to restructure your application so that it makes it easier to test now. Or it might be that you find a problem from half a sentence that never gets into the code because your knowledge about that type of things was involved at the right time. All of this mobbing has really led me to believe that we're doing, in this industry right now, we're doing a big disservice to ourselves by saying that there's this group of test automation engineers who don't identify as programmers. If those people would take a few steps more close to the programmers and the world of programming, they would probably amp up their own ability to do things and to contribute. And also I find that looking at my current organization, we still see these silos of different kind of like hierarchical groups. I have the amazing C++ developers. C++ is a super hard language if you haven't ever heard of that. It's so hard that only the smartest survive. I've heard this in the last 10 weeks. Python is the friendly language, the scripting language that anyone out of pretty much anywhere can learn and can get started on. But it's also one of the most powerful scripting languages. It's an actual real programming language that enables you to do just about anything you can do with C++. So it's an endless world, but it's a different world. And then there's these people who don't want to touch the Python code, don't want to read the C++ code, but rather spend their time maybe on the application without knowing of any of that, the other world. And if we don't actually bring these together, if we don't collaborate well, then we're going to be stuck in the troubles of hoping that things would be easier, that they just won't get to that. So collaboration helps us a lot with that. And the idea that we wouldn't be learning programming when we're automating, I think that's just far off, all in general. Sometimes I hear that when you put this many people together, or even a pair together, it's wasting time and effort. But actually, it changes the nature of the work we're doing when we have a group working together. If you're working on a hard problem alone, and you just don't know what to do. I have one of my test automators right now that seems to be struggling with this kind of approach. She waits for 3 days or 2 days, and then when she didn't figure it out herself, then she comes and asks, and somebody helps her over that. But it usually takes a lot of time before she gives up and like realizes that, hey, there's this big gap. And if nobody would be available to help her, the problem just won't proceed, like the solution won't proceed. So with hard problems, when you bring people together working on it, you get a solution. You get the probably even a better solution than just out of one person. But with simple problems, when you're doing something really mundane, something that no one should even be doing alone. I've heard this as a manual tester from some developers a lot of times that you shouldn't be doing that at all. Sometimes. Then what happens is innovation. They tell you that, hey, here's the tool that you never knew how to ask for. This is going to put all the data for you in the database readily. And that's one example of the type of innovation that could happen. So you might want to consider that. But all of this mind share, what I really wanted to share on this is that there's all kinds of aspects, all kinds of tasks that you can work on in this manner. I wanted to first make my team do programming together in a mob format so that they would learn to talk better to each other. That alone already improved our quality tremendously when the developers started collaborating with each other better. But I also brought in tasks around adding Selenium. I brought in tasks around let's change components, let's implement new features, let's have us all be there at the same time. And I saw how one person would say, here's a thing we can call, another would add, like, here's another thing, and another, and another, and another. And you would end up with the best possible solution that you can within a very limited time frame. So for me, at first, I didn't intend this mechanism to bring me back to programming. But after 6 months, going back into my blog where I said how much I will end up hating this and how I will do this only for the benefit of my team, because they need to talk to each other, I started realizing that I had again found the love of programming. I had again found the love of programming for test automation purposes. And I started realizing that a lot of the stuff I didn't intend to learn, but it kind of came through osmosis because I was just in the room doing my bits and pieces while we were doing these things. But the same thing also happened on the developers on learning how to think properly around test automation, around testing in general, and finding the problems that we might have in our applications. So for me, it kind of sums up to this idea that we all kind of think somehow that we're good at our own areas. But when we put our skill sets together, there's overlap, and then there's holes, gaping holes that the other person's knowledge fills in. So this all, the mindshare idea, is really on the idea that whatever information sharing you might be struggling with, having your group come together and work not on just talking about it, but actually doing something, some task in that area, you might see magical changes with people starting to feel more empathetic about whatever the other ones are doing and understanding how their knowledge could contribute to help the others in the overall process. So it's not really about what I'm doing and how I'm optimizing my work, but it's about us working together and getting things done. Okay. The third part of what I've learned is that all too often we're looking at the world of test automation from the point of view that we're somehow stuck in the idea of regression testing. We might be looking at unit testing and integration testing and system-level testing, but we're still looking for ways of running automation and again, and giving us feedback about how we are in comparison to past days. But even to do this kind of thing, I find that there's so many things going on in the world of automation that way too often we're focusing inwards into our own organizations, and we might not always see the things that other people are doing. So I wanted to share some of the things that have been kind of lighting me up in the last couple of years. The first part, I think this is kind of obvious in some ways, but I still seem to be running into this a lot, that we could be using automation a lot more in our environments. How many of you are doing something in Amazon clouds nowadays? I find that comes along a lot more often to me nowadays than before. Like people are just spinning up new test environments or even production environments. We do blue-green deploys so that we can always have a working version and we can easily change between different versions that are running in production when we're doing web-based applications. The whole environment automation, getting set up automatically, running builds, making them available automatically, it's a big part of the types of things that we could be doing. And in a lot of organizations, we still maybe don't do enough of that. That's been my experience. Another thing that really I like a lot in the world of automation is testing through APIs. Even if I do so-called manual testing, exploratory testing is preferably the word that I would use, I often do my testing through an IDE, programming tools, writing a bit of code, but with the idea that whatever code I write, it's not meant to be there to maintain forever. It's not meant to be rerun, But it exists to give me ideas about the things that might be wrong with that API, how we put things together in that API, how we set data up, or how we set different calls into a chain of events, and kind of this developer experience perspective a lot. So I find that in increasing amounts, I'm seeing and using automation as something that is to be thrown away after it's been written, and it's not even intended to be kept. I'm also seeing other people report and share ideas about doing BDD so that you very purposefully write BDD automation tests, but as soon as the feature is ready and in production, you delete all of it because it already helped you to that point, or maybe you leave just a couple of tests. So the idea that some of the automation that we write is meant to be deleted, it's never meant to stay there. I find that it's an idea that would be beneficial for a lot of us in our organizations. Selenium is still a big part of this world. Anyone here using Selenium in your projects? Quite many? Yeah. It's been around a while, and it's kind of become a de facto standard. I still see really, really ugly Selenium code in a lot of organizations that I've worked with. I see very straightforward, basic kind of like procedural structures, which usually come from the fact that we haven't yet wanted to learn about things on becoming more of a programmers. Page object pattern has been around forever to help us kind of get forward from doing these big clunky scripts and get more maintainability into our scripts. But also I'm very happy to notice that we're talking about things like screenplay pattern, where we are trying to bring in the tester perspective intent and small pieces, really small pieces of code. Very much the coding principles even more, further into this so that we would have more maintainable things. So it's nice to know that even something that has been around a while and has been kind of seemingly static for a while, it's still growing and going forward. So you might want to, if you haven't yet, you might want to look into that a bit. Another thing that I keep running into is the pain of brittleness. We can't find elements. And it's also nice to notice that in various groups, there seems to be these ideas of multi-locators, having different ways, automated ways of, trying a couple of different ways of identifying where the element is that we're wanting to click. And even if one of them works, that also takes us forward. So instead of just working on, let's find one that works, maybe we could have these reusable libraries of locators. So this is also something that I've been liking to see happening. On the unit test side, going from just asserts, simple asserts and simple checks, going into more of describing the whole object and pushing information about that object into a file and doing file comparisons and having tools that pinpoint the problems on failure. Me and my team, at least, we've had really good success and experiences with these type of tools. Doing more complicated work on typically old code bases that were not under tests before in a quite fast manner through approval tests. It's just a different way of thinking about unit tests in the sense that with asserts, we're defining what we're expecting. With approvals, we're pushing things into a file, we're verifying them kind of as a manual tester would, and then we're comparing things. So again, make sure your tool set is as wide as possible. I've also liked the fact that I've started to see that I've talked for years, being a tester, background person, I've talked about partial oracles, and I've watched Doug Hoffman and Kim Kainer work on this area, realizing that the developer community talks about the same thing with the name theory tests. All of a sudden, we had so much more common ground with the developers, understanding that we are actually trying to solve the same things. the ideas with theory tests is just that you have these rules that are always true, and you generate a lot of data, a lot of examples that you're testing against, instead of having specific examples. Again, thinking in a bit different way. And finally, model-based test automation. This is nothing new. I used to do this 12 years ago in one of my jobs. Model-based test automation with the idea that you will draw these, boxes and arrows and you will generate test code. I see that now, in the modern day, like in the recent days, for example, Spotify is still talking about doing a lot of their test automation in these kind of manners, generating tests. And I think it's a very promising one approach to covering combinations and like longer chains in functionality, instead of writing all your tests separately. And I've seen very good examples of how we can find long fuse bugs that are hard to find otherwise. So with all of this, I wanted to just encourage you to take some of the words that I mention here as things that you might want to be looking into, but also maybe talking to some of your colleagues around you and asking around what's the thing that they're into, and looking more widely into automation than what is just the usual suspects. But all of this really sums up into the idea that we've been working hard on automation for, I think, several decades. In the last 10 years, we've taken significant steps forward in many organizations. And I find that while I could argue 10 years ago that this automation thing doesn't make much sense, I see too much of good and useful automation these days, so that I would want to be in any way against it. Quite contrary, I want to be there to support it. But we are not done yet. We're not ready yet. The tools are not always trustworthy enough yet. But we have the ability to change those tools, take things forward. And the good enough of today, it's really not good enough of tomorrow. So at least for me, looking at the 20 years of experience that I have in this industry, we keep going forward every day. And the best way to go forward is together. So I encourage you to share and learn together, work together, make sure you have the mind share. You learn things that you never expected to learn when you work together in a close collaboration. All right? Questions, comments, ideas?
So you mentioned that you worked for a company that for a year and a half did not have any tests and was doing continuous delivery.
Yes.
But at some point of time they decided to implement tests. Why?
Yes, because I pushed for it. The reason why I pushed for it is that I believe, I'm quoting one English gentleman right now, I believe that software risk is best taken in small pieces, small cartons. So while you buy milk in a big box and it's cheaper, software doesn't work that way. Smaller risk at a time is better. We were struggling with sticking to our schedules and keeping our quality on a good level when we were doing bigger changes. So the idea of doing small changes that you can do and put on production on a daily basis, it alone improved our quality significantly because it enabled the manual testing to happen specifically for each of the changes separately, even without any automation.
Yeah, such question you said about like looking into tomorrow. Do you know, does any organizations now are trying to implement like using of artificial intelligence in automation? Because I read a few articles that some companies are working on building like frameworks which will use machine learning into that.
Yeah, I've also heard about those. I've been trying to follow those, and that would definitely be one of those pet projects that I'd love to do at some point. But I left it out from my list of things because I don't have a personal experience on that yet. Mm-hmm. It's an interesting route.
Yeah, thanks.
And we had a gentleman there.
I would like you to ask about differences and pros and cons of screenplay versus page object pattern. Mm-hmm. Why I should resign page object pattern for screenplay, right?
I don't know if you should or not. I'm not sure about that. What I'm saying is that I'm seeing that sometimes with the page object pattern, the things are, they get kind of big already. And when you bring in a developer, like a programmer, professional programmer, to work on those, they tend to want to refactor them without knowing about any of the automation patterns, and they tend to be somehow wanting to go to smaller pieces. That's just, you know, the usual refactoring that comes from people who write good and maintainable code. And when those people then together with me are looking at, like, hey, there's this page object pattern versus there's this screenplay pattern, they seem to be more into the screenplay as better expressing intent and being more maintainable. And again, I think that might also be a bit of a preference thing. So I find that sometimes testers, without as much programming knowledge, they might be easier to go into the page object side. So again, it's not either or necessarily, but it's more like an encouragement of see what else that would take you to if you would also look into that approach.
Just two small questions, a little bit less serious than the previous ones. About Mindshare, did you find that there is a specific group size that should not be exceeded in this case? Because the more people that are there in the group, well, the more complications in communication.
I have a rule on how I define what would be a good learning mob size. And the rule is that during the session that we're doing, everybody needs to be getting on the front of the keyboard a minimum of 2 times, but preferably 3 times. So if we're doing 2 hours of mobbing and we have 10 people, it means that the cycle time is probably around 4 minutes, and then you barely get twice onto the computer. So it depends on the kind of how long you're going to be mobbing. When you mob on a longer term, they usually talk about 2 pizza teams, American pizzas, meaning about 6 to 8 people.
Okay.
Finnish pizzas, not enough. Like, that's 2 pizzas is much smaller.
The second question is, because it got me curious, I know enough about Finnish language that I know I will live to regret this question, but how do you pronounce your name?
My name is Maaret Pyhäjärvi. So the difficulties are the U in the beginning and the R in the middle. So that's nobody can do that.
Thank you.
I think this is a good place to stop. I'm happy to talk with any one of you after this, and it was really great being here, so thank you for having me.